Linebacker is quietly one of the Falcons' biggest needs entering this offseason, but can they count on Troy Andersen in 2023? And who else will step up to take the other spot next season?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, and of course, the most humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Nissan. The only thing more exciting than the big game this year is the all-new, all-electric 2023 Nissan Ariya. There's only 5 days left until the Super Bowl. Are you ready? The Nissan Ariya, the EV for people who love to drive. Learn more at nissanusa.com. And guys, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, and you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. Help us get over 5,000 subscribers there, guy, if you haven't already subscribed. And also check us out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV by downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV. So, guys, we're talking about the Falcons linebacker position, right, as part of our year-end positional reviews. It's quietly kind of a big need for the Falcons, the linebacker position. And that's due to the fact that the current options on the roster are not necessarily stellar based off of their 2022 play. Collectively, I thought the linebacker play this year was pretty underwhelming. And while I wasn't a person that thought the Falcons should have traded for Roquan Smith, that trade to me didn't make a ton of sense for the Falcons to give up draft assets there. But certainly I gotten, I guess, exasperated with the linebacker play enough down the stretch that I was like, yeah, you know what? Maybe they should have traded for Roquan Smith to get some competent linebacker play in the room. But, I do think there's the potential that we will see improved play from this group next year. And a lot of that rests on someone like Troy Andersen developing. And when I look back at Troy Andersen's rookie year in 2022, it wasn't a great season for him overall, but he did exceed my expectations in several ways. One of the main concerns I had about Troy Andersen making the jump from Montana State to the NFL, given his limited experience of playing the linebacker position in college. But that came with it some mental issues, or not mental issues, like some, elements of his game and from an instinctual standpoint that it was probably going to be lacking. But my main concern with Troy Andersen was, okay, does he have the physical element? And he was not a particularly physical player in college. And so I was very worried about him, the NFL being just too physical a league for him. And while I won't say it was a non-issue for him as a rookie, it was not as massive a hurdle as I thought it would be. So that's part of the reason why he sort of exceeded my expectations, my relatively low expectations heading into the season. And we saw Troy Andersen make his starting debut in that week 6 game against the 49ers. And that got a lot of hype afterwards because he got 13 tackles in that game. And, people love the box score scout. As I talked out and broke down on the film review that week, after that week, was I thought his performance was pretty ho-hum in that game. And, I think some of the reasons why it was being overhyped was due to certain narratives surrounding other linebackers that either were currently on the team or had just recently been traded from the team. We'll talk more about that a little bit later when we talk about Mykal Walker. But after that point, we saw Troy Andersen sort of take Mykal Walker's starting job after the bye week. That was one of the changes that the Falcons made after sort of assessing their bye week. And I thought Andersen mostly struggled for those final 4 games, but you did see some flashes of some positive things. He had a forced fumble in one of those games that was a big play. And then the week 18 game, he really showcased his pass rush ability. Pro Football Focus charted him with 5 pressures, 3 hurries, and 2 hits. I myself in my charting gave him 1 more hurry along with those 2 hits for a total of 6 pressures in that game. And I think one of the reasons why I think throughout the season, his pass rush was probably the thing that he was best at, because it's probably the most simple thing that he could do, which is kind of like see ball, get ball, run through this A gap, blow up that running back and go hit the quarterback. And so I think that led to him being the most effective as a pass rusher as a rookie, because that required the least amount of thinking. And one of the things that's interesting about, young players, I think there's often a assumption with most fans and media that, a player's young, they'll get better at certain things. And you have to figure out and you have to evaluate the player. Like, what is he struggling with? Is he struggling with the physical element, or is he struggling with the mental elements? Because the physical elements really don't necessarily go away. If you're not fast enough, you're not strong enough, those types of things aren't going to really get better with time. But if it's the mental elements, that is something that you do expect to get better. And I do think with Troy Andersen, it was, more of that mental stuff that he can get better at. And I think he will get better at with time. Some of those things are related to playing physically, like when it comes to disengaging and leveraging blocks and improving his run fits. Those are areas that he's going to have to get better, just because of the way that the Falcons want to play defensively under new defensive coordinator Ryan Nielsen, playing with those soft boxes that we've touched upon in previous episodes, where you're going to play with 6 man in the box. And if you have to be able to stop the run, and that requires your linebackers along with your defensive linemen to be physical and be better in their run fit. So essentially, like, Troy Andersen's going to be in a situation, if he's going to be a starter, he's going to have to sink or swim when it comes to getting better in the run fits, because the way that the Falcons are going to want to play moving forward requires him to have to get better. And again, I think with time and with development, he will get better. The coverage element of his rookie season was a little lackluster, right? Like, my charting showed he was the least effective of the Falcons' 3 linebackers, along with Mykal Walker and Rashaan Evans, in coverage, whether it was man or zone coverage. But I don't think that's due to a lack of ability. Again, I think that was just the mental elements of the game being a little bit too much, being out of position, those types of things, not reacting in time on a couple of those plays. So I think that's going to be another area where we will start to see him get better and improve and start to live up to the athleticism, where he's clearly the best athlete of the Falcons linebackers and has a lot of potential there in coverage. So, I fully expect Andersen to be penciled in as a starter heading into 2023, that when we're doing our positional previews, like 6 months from now, going into the summer and in the season, we'll be talking about Troy Andersen as one of the team's 2 main linebacker starters. And I think it'll be interesting to see sort of what the new regime under Nielsen envisions his role exactly to be. Because when you look at the Saints defenses over the last couple of years, obviously you've had a guy like Demario Davis as the sort of that rock in the middle, that Mike linebacker, more of that downhill run defender, also a superb blitzer, one of the best blitzing linebackers in the league, and also no slouch when it comes to coverage. So a do everything type of linebacker. And I think Troy Andersen at least has the skill set to be a similar type of player. I recall a conversation with Jarvis at some point during the season. I can't remember if it was on the podcast or off the air, where we were talking about Troy Andersen, comparing him to Demario Davis. And Demario Davis was, as good as he has been these last, 4 or 5 years in New Orleans, he was a late bloomer. Like he kind of struggled early in his career, and it really wasn't until like year 6 in his NFL career before he became the Demario Davis that he is today. And so, I feel like Troy Andersen has the potential to be that type of player, but maybe even sooner in his NFL career. And we'll see if he can develop that. Or could we see Troy Andersen more being as the guy that can be the will linebacker in this Saints scheme, where you've seen Pete Werner sort of fill that role the last couple of years? You had Quan Alexander there briefly in New Orleans for a year or two, sort of playing that role and being more of that sort of space player, that sideline to sideline coverage sort of specialist guy. And of course, again, Andersen has the skill set potentially to be that, due to his speed, his range, his coverage potential as well. So I feel like Troy Andersen could fit in a variety of ways within this defense moving forward. It was just going to be a question of exactly how this coaching staff sees him in that role. But I think that flexibility does give you a lot of more opportunities to find other players that may be maybe a little bit more limited and sort of have a complementary player with Troy Andersen. I feel like, if you're wanting Troy Andersen to impact right away, the most right now, probably the will linebacker is probably the best role. But again, I think that potential is there for him to be that Demario Davis, like Mike linebacker, down down the road if you're willing to be a little bit patient with him. So he is a project, but he's a very talented project. And you go back to the conversation we had during my scouting report back in May of him, and the player I said his ceiling comparison was Fred Warner. Now, that didn't necessarily mean I think he's going to be Fred Warner, who's arguably the best linebacker in the league right now. But basically what I was saying was the best version of the type of linebacker that Troy Andersen, I think, is and has the potential to be is Fred Warner. It's similar to the conversation when we drafted Calvin Ridley, where I said the best version of what Calvin Ridley can be is Marvin Harrison. Not to say that he's going to be a future Hall of Famer, but that's the best version of his type of player. And I think that's the same with Troy Andersen and Fred Warner. Maybe he's only 75% of Fred Warner, but 75% of Fred Warner is a really good linebacker. So we're hoping that we'll see that type of development from Troy Andersen. We'll be monitoring him again, not expecting that to be day one, week one next year, but it's really going to be about how much development he shows from week 1 to week 18 next season. So that's going to be a thing that we're going to keep an eye on for Troy Andersen over the coming months and years. But while I think Troy Andersen is one part of the Falcons linebacker equation, who's going to be the guy that lines up next to him? That's going to lead to a conversation about whether Rashaan Evans or Mykal Walker could be that guy, or the Falcons need to look outside the organization to find that other linebacker. And we'll talk about that as we continue today's episode. But today's episode is also brought to you by the Ultimate Football GM. And you've heard me talk about this fun new mobile game. And if you've ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your own football franchise, your dream has now come true. And this is definitely the game for you. You manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through a season, build your dynasty, you fire coaches and coordinators, you make trades, you're navigating your team through free agency, the draft, and all the ups and downs of the season. I've had several listeners already in the Locked On Falcons Discord talk about how much fun they've been having playing the game. It's a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free. It's a playable offline. You can play on the go as you want and when you want. And that's what I love about this game is like I can play it. I can go hardcore for a couple of days on it, and then I can put it down for a couple of days and feel like there's no obligation or anything that I've missed there. And we've now created a Locked On League for you guys to compete against other Locked On fans all over the world. Just choose Locked On League in the app to join. And our listeners will also get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On in all caps in the game store. That's Locked On, LOCKEDON in all caps. So you make sure you check it out today. So download the game by visiting ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. So when we talk about the Falcons linebacker position with Troy Andersen penciled in at one spot, I don't expect the other guy when the Falcons play, predominantly their 4-2-5 nickel for, roughly 60+% of their snaps this year. I don't expect that other linebacker to be a guy that's already on the roster. But let's break down those current options that currently are here, starting with Rashaan Evans. And I think, I wasn't a huge fan of Rashaan Evans' play this past year, but he did do some good things, right? Like, his game is really being more that downhill run stuffer, shooting gaps, blitzing. He even broke up a couple of passes this past year. And my charting actually said that he's the best coverage linebacker on the team, at least in terms of his production, looking at certain metrics like passer rating allowed and success rate allowed, even though like watching with my eyes, like he clearly is very limited in coverage. And I think my main issue with Rashaan Evans is like those limitations in coverage are not offset quite enough by his prowess against the run and being that force against the run. Is kind of the opposite of Deion Jones, where for years Debo was a elite coverage guy and you kind of were able to forgive him in terms of his run defending limitations. And then over time, he became less effective in coverage, Deion Jones, that is. And so you stopped being as forgiving of some of those deficiencies against the run. And like, that's the kind of the opposite with Rashaan Evans, where it's like, he's like, yeah, he's a limited against coverage, but if he's a dominant run defender, you're willing to forgive that. But he's not, at least this past year, wasn't really a dominant run defender. But again, I'll give him some credit. He was a solid bridge guy for what the Falcons kind of needed. He stepped in midway through the season and took over calling the defense, wearing the green dot. That was a responsibility he didn't have in Tennessee. So it was nice to see him step up in that regard. I've been a proponent of Dean Pease and the defender of Dean Pease on this podcast over the last year or two. But one of the positives I would say from Dean Pease stepping away from the game is it probably means that the Falcons are not going to bring back Rashaan Evans as a byproduct of that. And so I can sit here and say that's the silver lining when it comes to Evans. Not because he's a bad player, but just because I think his limitations are, he was a bridge, right? Like he's not a guy that you're going to build around for the long term, but he's just a bridge guy. And so, while I think you could justify the Falcons bringing him back at another cheap price, right? It doesn't make a ton of sense to me because now the Falcons have money to spend, right? And so Rashaan Evans was kind of like, oh, you're trying to get the best bang for your buck at $2 million that you're going to be able to spend on the starting linebacker. And I think Rashaan Evans gave you relatively that, right? But now that you have more spending room, you have the potential to upgrade. And so now you're not hamstrung by only spending $2 million. Now you can spend $5 million or $8 million or $10 million, that sort of thing. So, let's talk a little bit about Mykal Walker. And I think we recently discussed him briefly on a Q&A that we did prior to the Senior Bowl a little bit. Walker's season, again, was probably a little underwhelming because in large part due to the fact that he got a lot of hype this summer for being a potential breakout player, and he did not break out, right? And while I wouldn't say Walker was awful this season, again, going back to something I mentioned earlier with certain agendas where it felt very much like there was, this sort of, Falcons Twitter and whatnot, but people were at each other's necks over the Falcons linebackers, and there was pro Deion Jones people and anti Deion Jones people. And Mykal Walker became a proxy in that fight. If you were pro Deion Jones, you were denigrating Mykal Walker. If you were anti Deion Jones, you were propping up Mykal Walker, and he got caught up in that. And so I feel like to certain people, Walker, depending on who you talk to, which side of the war you're fighting, Walker was a little overrated and also underrated in a lot of ways. And so going back to what we mentioned on that previous Q&A was the idea that Walker ceiling to me is about where I thought he would be when we drafted him in the 4th round of 2020, which is a guy that starts because you don't have better options. And I think that was definitely the case this past season and should not be the case again due to the aforementioned spending money in 2023. And so I think if Walker is reverting back to being a reserve player, that he's a very good reserve player. He's shown that he can be a functional starter that can check a lot of the boxes that you want, as a run defender, as a pass rusher, in coverage. He was also a very good special teams player for the first 2 years of his career, did not get really any opportunities there this past year due to him being a starter. But if he goes back to being that, he's a very valuable backup player to have. And, I think if we get to week 1 of 2023 and he's starting for the Falcons, to me, that probably indicates that something has gone wrong in terms of the Falcons offseason plans and whatnot. But I certainly think you can make a case that you can do a lot worse than Mykal Walker as a starter next to or instead of Troy Andersen next year. So, I do think there is some untapped potential and upside with him. So I'm not going to completely close the door on him, improving and becoming a better player beyond a quote unquote functional starter. And maybe 9 months from now, we're talking about, oh, look at the progress that Mykal Walker showed, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, instead of say a Troy Andersen or something like that. So that is certainly, a possibility that the Falcons are then looking to re-sign Mykal Walker, when he becomes a free agent after this upcoming season. But I'm not going to necessarily hold my breath. If that happens, then great. No one's going to complain about it. But I'm not going to sit here and hold my breath that that's going to be a likely outcome. And another player that fits into that reserve role and is also a free agent this offseason, along with Rashaan Evans, is Nick Kwiatkowski, right? And Kwiatkowski gave a lot of value on special teams this year. And that because of his past starting experience, again, is similar to Mykal Walker. It totally makes sense to me for the Falcons to bring him back as a reserve that, can come in a pinch and start games for you in the event of injuries and also give you value on special teams. But you could also imagine Kwiatkowski looking for greener pastures, better opportunities. Someone might be able to be more willing to pay him to at least compete for a starting spot, and he may seek that. And I would imagine the Falcons may not necessarily bend over backwards to bring him back, because him and Walker offers basically similar value to the team. And so if he does leave, that opens up an opportunity for, say, a Nate Landman or Dorian Etheridge, two guys that, spent the majority of the year on the practice squad, to step up into that void and be primarily special teams guys as probably the fourth linebacker on the team. And so that makes sense for me if the Falcons go in that direction. But because of that, because I feel like you have your number 2 guy in Andersen, your number 3 guy in Walker, and in between Kwiatkowski and Landman or Etheridge, probably your number 4 guy, that means that you have to go out there and get that number 1 guy at that linebacker position. I expect the Falcons to fully explore their options this offseason to find that player elsewhere. And we'll talk about some of those potential options to wrap up today's episode. But I want to tell you about PrizePicks, a fun new way to play daily fantasy. Pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 25 times your money, and you're not competing against other people. It's just you versus projections, and PrizePicks offers projections on pretty much any sport you can possibly imagine, whether it's the NFL, the NBA, NHL, WNBA, college sports, NASCAR, tennis, MMA, esports, boxing, pretty much everything. PrizePicks, it's safe, it's fast, it's easy. It's currently in operation in over 30 states in the US and Canada. All you got to do to enter is download the PrizePicks app, or you can go to prizepicks.com and sign up. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That's LOCKEDON. And that means if you deposit $100 and use that promo code, PrizePicks is going to give you $100. If you deposit $50, PrizePicks will give you $50. So don't forget that promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. And I want to tell you about Built Bar, because everybody wants to eat a little bit healthier this time of year. And if you're like me, you want to eat healthy but not have to compromise on taste. Built Bar is the thing for you. It's the healthy protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. And what makes Built Bar so good, it's just like candy bars that are covered in 100% real chocolate. And my tried and trues are flavors like peanut butter brownie and coconut almond. And not only do they taste great, they're healthy too, because you're only getting 130 calories, only 4 grams of sugar, and a whopping 17 grams of protein. And for years told you to go over to built.com and order yourself a new box, and you can still go there to check out new flavors and various sales. But more importantly, now guys, you can go to your local Walmart or Sam's Club to get yourself a box of Built Bars. That's right. Head to your nearest Walmart, walk to the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a 4-bar box of cookies and cream or double chocolate. And if you're at Sam's, run in and grab a 13-bar box of brownie batter or churro. You can thank me later. So wrapping up today's episode, talking about the Falcons linebacker positions, and, we're going to continue the theme that we've had throughout several of these positional reviews, where it becomes like, okay, the Falcons need to add more talent to the roster. We've known that now for quite some time. That's going to be the goal of this offseason, to really move the ball, move the needle in terms of the talent level of this roster. And the theme that we've expressed time and time again, and we'll continue today talking about the linebacker position, is that, free agency makes probably more sense for the Falcons to prioritize in terms of moving that needle at the linebacker position, just like several other positions. And, one could easily imagine seeing the Falcons signing one of these ex-Saints that's familiar with what the type of scheme that Ryan Nielsen's going to want to bring here to Atlanta. You have Caden Ellis. You have Quan Alexander, who worked with Frank Bush in New York and the Saints in recent years. AJ Klein, sorry, AJ. Alex Anzalone. All these guys are free agents this offseason, so they have some familiarity with this sort of scheme. And, we've talked in the past about how this regime under Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith predominantly have focused on signing players that they have familiarity with, whether they've worked with a coach like a Frank Bush or somebody else on this coaching staff in the past. And that's due to, the thing that Terry Fontenot constantly harps on, which is wanting to have the guys with the right makeup and character and all that stuff. And obviously coaches that have worked with these players are very familiar with what this player's makeup is, from the way they practice, the way they approach, the film room and all that sort of stuff in the locker room. But one of the questions we've had several times over the last several weeks is like, will that change now that the Falcons have spending room? Like, were they doing that because they had to basically bargain bin shopping? And so therefore, well, we're only going to be able to sign $1 million or spend $1 million on this player or this position. And so therefore, we're going to go with the known commodities that we know, in terms of knowing that we can only spend $1 million. So, we're familiar with the brands. I think the analogy I use is like, when you're eating on a budget, shopping on a budget, like you go to McDonald's because you're familiar and you know that dollar menu, that value menu, you're going to be able to stretch, $3 or $4 that, you're in and be able to eat well. But now that you have spending money, you're still going to McDonald's is basically the question I ask. And I'm very curious to see if the Falcons do that. And linebacker is one of those positions where if they don't go for one of these ex-Saints like Caden Ellis or Quan Alexander, they will have plenty of good linebackers available in free agency that they want to sign, right? Potentially. Like that's Levante David, or you have Tremaine Edwards with the Bills, or Edmonds with the Bills. You have David Long with the Titans, Quincy Williams with the Jets, TJ Edwards or Kaiser White with the Eagles, right? Jermaine Pratt with the Bengals, Drew Tranquil, Chargers, Bobby Okereke with the Colts, Leighton Vander Esch or Anthony Barr with the Cowboys, Devin Bush, Steelers, Denzel Perryman, Raiders, Alex Singleton, Broncos, Azeez Al-Shaair with the 49ers. And I'm sure you guys probably can come up with a couple other names at the top of this linebacker list that all could be pretty solid to very good starters for this Falcons if they're looking for somebody. You want a veteran to sort of teach Troy Andersen the ropes. It's not going to get better than Levante David, who's been one of the best linebackers in the league for a decade, right? If you want a young up and coming player, right, you can go after a Jermaine Pratt or David Long. If you want to go after, a young up and coming player that, has the potential to be a world-class linebacker, Tremaine Edmonds fits that boat. So many other options for the Falcons this offseason. And so because of that, like, to me, there's no real excuse for the Falcons to walk away from March without having signed one of these basically 20 guys that I just rattled off that they should be able to sign. Like it would be shocking to me if the Falcons didn't, solve their linebacker issues come free agency. But, they may like the draft a little bit better, or maybe they feel like they need to spend their money elsewhere. We'll see. I think notably on Tuesday, Lance Zierlein of NFL.com dropped a mock that had the Falcons taking Arkansas linebacker Drew Sanders at 8, right? And while I haven't done a deep dive on Sanders film, I have watched some of him. I think he's very good. I'm not quite convinced he's going to be a top 10 pick, but I certainly could very much see him going in the top 15, top 20 sort of range in the middle of this first round as the top linebacker off the board, and certainly has the skill set that I think you're looking for in this scheme, which is a guy that can, be another sort of Troy Andersen type of player, but maybe not as raw as Troy Andersen coming into the league with the size, the pass rush ability, the coverage ability, all that sort of things. So he makes a lot of sense for the Falcons, especially in the world if they were to, say, trade back a couple of spots for some team looking to leapfrog the Panthers to get a quarterback or something like that. Who knows? But while I haven't done a deep dive on this linebacker class, I've seen a couple of guys. And again, part of that is due to the fact that my expectations are the Falcons will solve their linebacker need in free agency. But the handful of guys I've seen, like I'm mildly impressed by them. And so if the Falcons don't sign that free agent or don't draft the Drew Sanders in round 1, there should be some options for them on day 2 of the draft. And, when I've consistently done my 7-round mock drafts on the various mock draft simulators out there in the world, I've consistently been mocking, linebackers to the Falcons in like rounds 5 and round 7, on day 3 of the draft, because I look at it where it's like, okay, well, Mykal Walker's entering contract year, right? And, if you let Kwiatkowski and Evans walk, right, and then you have Landman and Etheridge, right, like you want to bring in your own linebacker, right, with this new regime with Ryan Nielsen and whatnot. You want to bring your own guy into the building to potentially compete with Landman and Etheridge for that last linebacker spot, and also to potentially be groomed to replace Mykal Walker should he depart after this upcoming season as that third linebacker, and give you some depth, and maybe down the road that guy turns into a potential starter for you. So I do feel like the Falcons are in a position to bring multiple linebackers into the building, both in free agency and the draft. But like I said, I think this linebacker position that is not going to get as much oxygen as, say, the pass rush, or when, later this week when we talk about the secondary, right, where you have some obvious issues there. It's not going to get as much conversation there, but I do think linebacker is quietly one of the bigger needs that this team needs to address. And so we'll see how they address it, right? I know my personal bias against linebackers because I tend to put more focus on the front and the back end, and the linebackers kind of get lost in the shuffle. But, anybody will tell you that it's really hard to have a good defense. You know, I've made the statement, it's hard to have a good defense without good safety play, but it's also pretty hard to have a good defense without good linebacker play, although the Eagles probably will put that to the test. But then again, their linebackers were pretty good this year, despite the fact that they've invested virtually nothing in them. And so, we'll see what the Falcons do, right? I certainly think they're going to have to revamp and upgrade this front seven in order to play the style of defense that Ryan Nielsen wants to play. Obviously, the focus is going to be primarily on those guys up front and bringing that pass rush. But also, as I said, because of the way that they're going to play with softer boxes, you need to have your linebackers being able to carry a lot of the heavy lifting as well, particularly against the run, not to mention to be able to cover guys in all these dynamic tight ends that we're seeing throughout the NFL in these days. But that's it, guys, in terms of the linebacker position. We'll talk about the corners on tomorrow's episode and hopefully get to the safeties by the end of the week. We'll see if there's any other news that we need to discuss with the Falcons. I know Charles London left the team to become the Tennessee Titans passing game coordinator. That is another vacancy that the Falcons have to fill. So we'll see if the Falcons start filling some of these coaching vacancies by the end of the week, and that may push one of these, positional breakdowns into next week. And then we'll also have, of course, the all-important special teams breakdown as well at some point next week as well. So we'll see. We'll play it by ear with that, but we'll continue to push through these positional breakdowns to wrap up the year. And then Monday's episode, I know we'll do a mock draft Monday, and maybe that will be the time where we'll talk about some of these coaching changes as well. That will be a good opportunity for that. So that's what's in store here on Locked On Falcons. Please continue to make us your first listen each and every day on your preferred podcast platform. Check out Locked On NFL in the run-up to this year's big game. And of course, you can find them on all the same podcast platforms that you're currently watching or listening. Locked On Falcons. Check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.